Hello. Um, Again, this is Joanna Parker. I am your facilitator for the CDA with class. And as I'm grading assignments, I've noticed that I've been talking a lot about developmentally appropriate practice. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about developmentally appropriate practice to give you a little bit more information in terms of what I'm referencing. So typically when I do this presentation, I ask folks to think about DAP and how you would define that. And so the first piece is to write a definition, one sentence about what developmentally appropriate practice is. So I encourage you in your journal that you're using as part of the CDA process to reflect upon what is developmentally appropriate practice. And so part of that is writing a sentence to define that, right? And then I encourage you to circle 3 words within your sentence that really highlight the core of developmentally appropriate practice. And then I would ask you to put a star next to the one word that speaks to you the most in terms of how is it that we connect with children, how is it that we support children, how is it that we meet children where they're at, which really is at the center of developmentally appropriate practice. So developmentally appropriate practice helps us to understand how we should be with children, how we can support children's engagement, learning, and development. And so there are 3 basic concepts that are really at the core of developmentally appropriate practice. And I do want to point out that these materials are developed through the National Association for the Education of Young Children, or NAEYC. And if you go to the website naeyc.org/ like a backslash DAP, you will find lots of different resources. So the first is that knowledge must inform decision making. The second is that goals must be challenging and achievable. And the third is that teaching must be intentional to be effective. And so we'll explore each of these in a little bit more depth. So when we think about knowledge informs decision making, that's really thinking about the fact that as teachers, we really need to understand child development. And so we need to understand child development in general in terms of what a 6-month-old or a 12-month-old or a 3-year-old knows and is able to do in general, right? And so I've provided lots of resources and encouraged you to check out your state early learning standards because that's a really great resource that gives you some of this information in terms of what children know and are able to do across the domains of development. If you're using a formal assessment tool, such as Teaching Strategies Gold or the core that is part of HighScope, that also provides that information. You might also, I've referenced in some of my feedback, the Milestone Moments, which is a developmental checklist put out by the CDC that gives you some developmental information in terms of what children should know and be able to do at specific milestones. So when we talk about the milestones, that's 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, and 18 months of age, and then 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, and 5 years, right? So these are the milestones when typically through the well child schedule, children are going to the pediatrician. The other thing that you want to make sure that you have an understanding of is what the individual children in your classroom know and are able to do. So in Unit 2, we've spent some time exploring observation and assessment. You've done some research on different checklists that you might use to help you understand development, and checklists that you might use to help you really get to know the children in your classroom. I know this is challenging to find resources that are appropriate for infants and toddlers. Again, the Milestone Moments is a great resource. And then you also want to think about what is culturally important for each child. And so particularly with infants and toddlers, we have to take into account the priorities, beliefs, and values of the family, right? Because how we care for very young children has a huge cultural or family component. So when I think about culture, I think about big C and I think about little c. So big C is when we think about things like race, ethnicity, religion, some of those big categories. But really what's more important is the little c, because every family has their own traditions, their own beliefs, their own values. And we need to make sure that the way that we care for very young children matches the way that they're cared for by their parents. Now, obviously, this does not mean if the parents are neglecting or not providing adequate care for their child, we don't want to match that. But for example, if the parent of a 12-month-old is still feeding that child, whereas in childcare, we really often want to focus on and prioritize independence because you have 8 children or more that you're caring for, this might be a conflict. And so you want to talk about that, and you want to be honest, and you want to ask parents for more information in terms of how they're caring for children when they're at home, and thinking about how you can match that as much as when you're in care, or when the child's in care. You know, I worked as a childcare director for a number of years, and one of my infant teachers would always say that when the babies came in on Monday, they were quote unquote broken, because over the weekend, the babies had been held all weekend. And so then they came in from being the only child in the household to being one of 8. And so then the teacher felt like she was spending that whole Monday helping the child to figure out how to wait, right? And from my perspective, and really from best practice, we want to make sure that we're being as responsive as possible to infants and toddlers. And we want to respect families' choices in terms of how they care for their child, right? Things are different when you're caring for multiple children, but we want to do our best. And then you also want to think about what are ways in which that family might be caring for their child that might surprise you or might be different than the experiences that you've had. Because a lot of times the way that you care for young children as a teacher connects to how you were cared for when you were a young child by your parents. The next core component is that goals must be challenging and achievable. So once you've really understood what it is that children in general know and are able to do at a specific age range, you've observed and really gathered information about the children that are in your care so that you have an understanding of their development, then you can start to think about, well, what comes next, right? So you're meeting children where they're at, and then you're setting goals in terms of what it is that you want them to know and be able to do, right? And that's the reflecting on what goals come next, or thinking about what experiences, what interactions that you can provide that really support the engagement, development, and learning of that infant or toddler. And then the third is that teaching must be intentional to be effective. And this is really where the interactions or teaching practices comes in, and thinking about how we set up our environment, how we interact with children, how we follow infants and toddlers' leads, how we create a warm and nurturing environment and build relationships. All of those pieces that we're thinking about as you look at the class tool and what that looks like for infants and toddlers. And another big piece of that is your connections with families and working with families. So hopefully this has been helpful with your assignments, as well as you're going through the content in this course. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out either through the CDA facilitator email or through the water cooler. Thank you very much. Have a great day.